In chapter 2, I told you that audience analysis was probably the most important thing you would pick up in this class. I did not lie, but I did leave out the importance of chapter 3, or I perhaps downplayed the importance of chapter 3. And you'll understand this more when I talk about implicit and explicit persuasion. Almost everything you write is going to be persuasive in some way or another. And I went over that a bit in previous lecture. So this chapter is extremely important. Now it is linked to chapter 2. These two cannot be separated from each other. You need to understand your audience in order to persuade your audience. But read this chapter very carefully. It kind of underpins everything we're doing in this course and everything you'll do in not just your college, but also your workplace communication throughout your life, really. Lannon presents the workplace communicator, and I would say any communicator, as a problem solver. Okay, here's a situation, there's something I have to convey. How do I do that in a way that's effective? One concern is providing useful information. And this is where that audience and purpose profile is so important, because it helps you break down what you want your readers to do with your information and really get a clear idea of who your readers are. Okay, and that's not easy. So I don't want to be dismissive of this, like, oh, this is one thing you do, but now the important thing is, no, providing useful information is key. Also being persuasive. And being persuasive means getting the response that you want. So it doesn't just mean convincing somebody to believe something or do something. And Lannon addresses this by dividing up persuasion into implicit and explicit persuasion. So when you're trying to convince somebody to do something, you're trying to convince somebody to agree with you, that's explicit persuasion. But every message you give has an element of implicit persuasion. And this is when you want your readers to believe in your competence, in the accuracy of your information that you're providing them, in your concern for them, in your ability as an employee, your ability as a colleague, your truthfulness, your intelligence, all these sorts of things. If you think about how you try to present yourself in social situations, we live a lot of our lives trying not to look like idiots, trying not to look foolish, trying not to do. That is a form of persuasion. When I maybe bite back a really dumb joke because I don't want to look like look ridiculous, that is a form of implicit persuasion. In other words, I'm presenting myself in a certain way that will shape a response from the people around me, have them think of me a certain way. And I will tell you, I've never bitten back a lame joke for fear of embarrassment, and that probably explains a lot about my situation now. So implicit persuasion is that. So in the workplace, you want your boss to think you're a competent, and not just a competent, but a really able employee. You want your colleagues to respect you, like you. All those elements come into any communication. So any communication has that element of persuasion, even if it's not an explicitly persuasive document. There are three audience reactions that you can anticipate to a persuasion, to an effort to persuade. Compliance is the least of these, and that's a very important thing to realize. A lot of times we think if we have positional authority and we tell somebody to do something and they do it, we've won. So if I tell my son to clean his room and he cleans it, fine, he's complied, I've won. The problem with that is that response is, unless it is unless you've delivered the message in a way that it goes beyond just mere compliance. If somebody's doing it just because you have the authority to make them do it, it'll be a sort of grudging response. And a lot of times you will get the minimum amount of effort. So when I go into my son's room, I'm going to see stuff crammed under the bed, or stuffed in the lamps, or kind of buried under some clothes at the bottom of the closet. Things won't really be cleaned properly. This is really worrisome in the workplace. You make people come to an early morning meeting, and you don't explain why it's important. You don't really make the case for it. You just make them come. They'll come. But are they going to be attentive? Are they going to be inclined to respond favorably to whatever you're presenting to them? Identification is when you've convinced them. So it's a willing response and it's a productive response. But the ideal is internalization. And internalization, we're going to look at this when we look at the next slide as well. Internalization is when they have made your request their own. In other words, they are on board with you. They understand exactly why it has to be done, and they're doing it now because they see the value of it. Not because you've convinced them they should do it, but because it's as important to them as it is to you. three ways of connecting to the audience, and they're loosely, I think they usually loosely relate to these three possible responses. They're not limited to that. It's not a one-on-one correspondence, but anyhow, there's a connection. The first form of connection to your audience is that power connection. You have the authority to make them do it, so you do it. So if I assign a memo saying, listen, you're going to write a memo and tell people they have to attend training someplace or another, and I've made you the boss, you could respond to the memo and say, okay, well, I'm the boss, so I'm telling them they're going to do it. Would that be a great memo? Well, obviously not in my eyes, because you are looking at only this power connection. The problem with that is what response are you going to get? That compliance response, the bare minimum response. The relationship connection. Now, this is not the only way to establish identification with your cause. In other words, you can get somebody to do something, to be on board with it, because of the case you've made. They just may not have internalized it completely. But another way of motivating people, or another reason people will do things for you, is their connection to you. So they respect you, they have regard for you, they like you, they want you to owe them down the road, not in a really cold, callous way. But in a workplace, you help people out sometimes because it's nice to know that should you need the help, there'll be somebody there for you. So there's a relationship connection. Which can be effective. It's a great way to get people to do things for you, but they're not going to have the buy-in that they will have if they have actually internalized what you've asked them to do. And this is what Lannan here is calling it the rational connection, because what you've done is, with your persuasive skills, the case you've made in your document, you have managed to get them to internalize and make their own what you've asked them to do or asked them to believe. Okay, and so this way, again, it's not that they're doing it for you or because they have to. They're doing it because it is now the thing that they want to do. There are a number of constraints that can limit persuasion, and this is where I'll end this presentation. I'm not going to go into great depth in all of these. You need to read your textbook carefully too. But the thing to be aware of is there are limitations on how effective you can be, or what you can use to persuade, that are kind of beyond your control. Organizational constraints would be if there are company rules that might prevent people from doing what you've asked them to do, or prevent certain things. For example, you want to convince people to come to an early morning meeting, so you think, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll cater from Panera Bread. But then you discover that there's a company rule that requires you to cater only from their really, really awful cafeteria, right? So that suddenly drops out of your sort of toolbox for persuading your audience. Legal constraints, things you cannot ask people to do, or things you cannot use in your persuasive case to convince people to do things. And you have to be very careful about this, especially when you're dealing with external people, because if you're dealing with a customer, for example, and you violate a legal rule, you can be in very deep trouble. So if you make a promise that you know that you really can't legally keep, or you imply a product does things that it doesn't do, these are serious issues. Ethical constraints may not violate the law, but as we will see when we look at the chapter on ethics, there is a lot of wrong you can do that is perfectly legal. So these are constraints based on honesty and fair play. There are skeezy things, slimy things you can do that will get your audience to do what you want them to do or agree with you, but they're just wrong. And one of the impacts of that is if they see through it and they realize what you've done, you lose all credibility with them. And that's really the practical issue with ethics, is as soon as you're perceived as being unethical, people no longer trust you. And so whatever benefits you might have gained by that shady, dodgy behavior, you lose by losing the audience trust. Time constraints, getting things, asking for things at exactly the right time. So you've got a great idea, you proposed an excellent purchase for your department, but it's the end of the budget year and the money's not there. Or it's the beginning of the budget year and they don't know yet how much they're going to have to spend. That's a timing constraint. Social and psychological constraints are things beyond your control in the environment. A classic example of this is poor motivation. If you've got a very demoralized group of people that you're trying to persuade to take action, you are fighting an uphill battle. And that doesn't mean you give up on it. And there are ways to do it. And you'll see very powerful turnarounds in organizations where people just suddenly something happens and they're inspired again and they get over that hump of just deep demotivation. But this is one of the reasons you want to be so careful, for example, about relying on that compliance approach to persuasion, because the more if you demoralize your audience, then you actually minimize your ability to persuade them and really motivate them in future. So read the chapter. I hope this has been a useful overview, but read the chapter carefully. And as you read, ask yourself, how does this apply to the resume? How does this apply to my resume and cover letter? For example, when you are making a case and wait a second, did I? Oh my goodness, there are two more. Yes, I was just about to say, when you're gathering evidence for your claim, there is one more slide here I wanted to cover with you, and it goes back to your resume. So let me go back. When you are making your case in your cover letter and resume, um, what is your relationship with your audience? What can you do to actually motivate them to get them to internalize your case, so that they see you as a candidate they really want to meet? They can see you joining them in the workplace. Here's the last slide I wanted to go over with you, and I'm sorry it slipped my mind. You need to support your claims with evidence. Okay. The second bullet here says appeal to common goals and values, and that's very important as well. In a cover letter and resume situation, how do you do that? Well, the first thing you've got to do is find out the common goals and values you share with the target for your resume and cover letter. This is why you've got to do research. You're applying for an ad in the paper at Dow, but you've got to do some research and see what are the goals and values that that division claims to have. I mean, you go onto their website, you'll at least see the ideal, and you can make a connection with those and your own personal goals, your own professional goals. That's extremely important. It shows the reader that you may fit in at that organization. It also shows just a little bit of gumption that you have bothered to get that information and made that connection. Also, you must always offer convincing evidence. So that means offering evidence. So you can't say on your resume that you're ready to perform as a CNA or programmer or whatever, without offering evidence of that. So what evidence do you offer? You offer evidence from your work history and from your education. Okay. In the cover letter, if you say that you're a highly motivated team player, that's no good unless you give some evidence of a situation in which you've demonstrated that. And it doesn't have to be a long anecdote for every piece of every claim you make, but there has to be some evidence there. And that is truly the last slide. I hope this has been useful. Read the chapter carefully, and as you read again, be thinking about how this applies to the current writing situation. Doing that will make it easier for you then to apply it to future writing situations as well, and it does apply throughout.